Good morning and welcome. What is the one human quality that drives us to success while causing all sorts of problems at the same time? Ambition. Ambition is one of the driving forces in our lives. It propels us to exceed at our jobs, it pushes us to reach our goals. It can give us a reason for living. Ambition is one of the tools that the world uses to measure success. Deep down, I think all of us want to be great. And not just great at what we do, but great in the sense of perceived as great. In the same way the disciples in today's gospel reading wanted to be great. It's natural. We human beings want to be significant. We want to be somebodies. No one wants to live their life as a nobody and die in obscurity, remembered for nothing. We want to be somebodies. We want our life to count for something. We want to achieve something and ultimately get the recognition and authority and greatness that comes with being somebody. And that's not true just for us, but has been true for every human being throughout human history. Which is why it shouldn't surprise us to find Jesus' disciples, even in the midst of a discussion about their master's impending suffering and death, discussing amongst themselves which one of them would be the greatest. But there is another way to measure success, one that's not of this world, and that's the topic of the gospel reading from Mark 9:30-37, which we're looking at this morning. We sometimes think that we can measure success in the way that the world does. We mistakenly believe that if God receives glory for what we do, well then we should be glorious in doing it as well. But let's just quickly think about some of the faithful people mentioned in the Bible. Their situations are far from glamorous. Noah built, Abraham moved, Moses led, Josiah restored, Rahab protected, David conquered, Nehemiah repaired, Ruth stayed, Jeremiah preached, the widow gave, the apostles went, the early church persevered. None of those actions were glamorous. Ordinary people did extraordinary things, and even though they might have thought their actions were insignificant at the time, the Lord, through His Word, has allowed us the opportunity to see the role that these people played in the greatest story ever told. But let's go back to the disciples, who've been arguing about which one of them is the greatest. Now, this argument amongst the disciples isn't an isolated incident, but it reveals a recurring issue. Throughout their time with Jesus, they struggled with questions of status and power. They were influenced by the prevailing cultural norms of their time, which equated greatness with authority and prominence. Not much has changed. The disciples' debate about greatness contrasts sharply with Jesus' teaching. Their focus was on their own status, rather than on understanding and embracing the true nature of Jesus' mission. And how does Jesus respond to this? He presents a child to them, and he says, "Whoever welcomes a child like this in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." What an odd thing to do, and why a child? Was Jesus trying to break their concentration by focusing them on someone cute? I don't think so. Was he wanting to offer the child as an example to them? He does that elsewhere. In Matthew 18, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." But the instruction here is not to be like little children, but to accept them, not to emulate them, but to be open to them. The whole point of the child is that the child is not great, not in the society in which Jesus was teaching especially. Children were considered weak, vulnerable, needy. They contributed nothing to society. In the society of Jesus' day, children were not worth very much. Infant mortality rates were high. Children were always the first to suffer from famine, disease, war, dislocation. According to one study I came across, up to 60% of children in those regions didn't make it to their 16th birthday. And so a child was on a par with a slave, essentially, and only after receiving maturity could they become a full human being and inherit the family estate. And yet Jesus says, this is the person I identify with. This is the person you need to be spending time with. This child is the one who needs you. This child is the one you need to receive and welcome. For when you receive this child, you receive me. And when you receive me, you receive not only me, but him who sent me. We want to be powerful. We want to be significant. But Jesus' bias is always towards the marginalized, the powerless, the vulnerable, the insignificant. And here we are wanting to be great and engage ourselves in important things and hang out with great and important people, while Jesus urges us to spend time with the weak and the vulnerable. If anyone wants to be first, they must be last and servant of all, he tells us. And Jesus, of course, doesn't just teach us this with his words. He modeled it. The proof of that is the fact that he was able to produce a child at all. I don't know how you've pictured this scene. We're told at the beginning of the passage that Jesus had been traveling with his disciples and that he didn't want everybody knowing where they were, and yet in the middle of his teaching them something, he suddenly produces a child. Where does the child come from? Well, evidently there were children around. Even when the multitudes had gone home and it was just Jesus and his closest group of followers with him, there were still children in the group, and a woman, no doubt, as well. Only the 12 get an explicit mention by the gospel writer. But evidently it went without saying that wherever Jesus was, there would be children and women, and any number of other people that society would have deemed unworthy of mention, but who were in fact the very people that Jesus most identified himself with and wanted to spend time with. We want to be faithful to Jesus, but we want to be great too. To be successful, to be significant, to be winners, to move in the winner's circle, to hang with the great ones, and to be remembered as someone who was really somebody. It's only natural. The only problem is that this is not compatible with the gospel. The greatest people in God's kingdom are not the rich and the powerful, but the poor and the helpless. Not the ones with the most servants, but those who serve others the most. Jesus argued that if we help those who are humble, lowly, poor, or oppressed, we will be successful from a heavenly point of view. And the disciples didn't realize this. They didn't get it. They were still thinking of success in worldly terms. They were concerned with using earthly ambition to get ahead in heaven. And Jesus knew that this was what the disciples were talking about, even though they didn't answer his question when he asked them. You see, and we know this, Jesus knows everything about us, what we think, what we feel, what our thoughts are. He knew what their problem was, and he also had the solution. They tried to hide their discussion, but they really should have known better that you can't hide anything from God. The disciples couldn't understand the true meaning of power described by Jesus because they were afraid to ask the right questions. Instead of asking how they could better understand and fulfill Jesus' mission, their main concern was finding out how each of them could become the biggest and the best and the greatest. The disciples' attitude was one that Jesus had to address. And we have to do the same. If not, we'll end up conspiring with sinners to defeat righteousness. God disciplines his children by speaking the truth to power and by offering correction. We and the disciples need to learn that the true heavenly power that Jesus established is in the form of service to others. But we know that it can be difficult for us to let go of our desire to succeed in earthly ways. It's part of our human nature that we want to be in control. We want to be independent. We want to be in control of our lives and our goals, and this includes the desire to succeed. We need to let go and allow God to control our destiny and successes if we want to be first in his eyes. We need to let go of our desire to get ahead and replace it with a desire to serve others, particularly the less fortunate. Now, I'm not saying that if we're successful in our career or whatever aspect of our life, that it's a bad thing. But what is driving that success? Is it a desire to serve God through the work that we do and not being concerned about how that makes us look? Or is it a desire for self? The Lord might very well call us to do simple and humble acts that show compassion toward other people and which display God's character, and not some way out there extraordinary act. These simple deeds aren't done for personal gain. They're done out of an outflow of God's love in us and for his glory. Jesus constantly challenges us to be a servant, to think of others instead of ourselves. If we feel unhappy and unfulfilled in our lives, maybe it's time to take a long, hard look at what our life is actually like. We need to ask ourselves if we are I-centered or others-centered, because our decision will affect our destiny. The child in this gospel passage represents the new birth or a new start necessary for real leadership and real life. The road to true happiness is the road of service. The way to greatness is not possible without a servant heart, a servant hand, a humble heart and a humble hand. And Jesus himself is our best example of the greatness of service and humility. He came to earth as a servant. He humbled himself to the point of death and thereby became highly exalted by God. Some people might think that serving someone is beneath them, or that somehow the act of serving others diminishes them. On the contrary, those who serve the most are the greatest, on earth and in heaven. Those who would be first must be last. This is the opposite of our ambitious ways. But we have to admit that Jesus was right. Our ambitions are often compulsive and suspicious and obsessive and jealous and resentful and full of revenge. The only ambition that truly gives life is the ambition to serve others. In God's eyes, what is important is not what we have to offer or what we do not have to offer, but who we are and our willingness to serve. It means relying on God's strength instead of our own. Remember what God says to Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. And so faith is not about church doctrine or power or privilege. It's about service to others, service to the point of sacrifice. It can be expressed equally through individual actions and experiences, as it can be expressed in church-wide attitudes and actions and public declarations. But each and every day, we will have the opportunity to show how Christ's love can bring healing to our hurting world. How through our actions, Christ's love can be made known to those who don't know him. The only way that we can do this clearly is with the greatest humility, just as Jesus did when he set the little child among the disciples. And so may we actively seek out and eagerly embrace every opportunity to serve our Lord. Amen.